You know, when you're young, you believe that sacrifice is always rewarded, that if you give all you have, the world will give it back to you somehow. Today, I want to tell you a story that proves sometimes it doesn't. It's a story from my own life about how I sold everything I owned so my son could study, and how I ended up with nothing but silence. Before I begin, I'd like to ask you, if you enjoy listening to true stories like this, you can follow our channel so you don't miss the next one. But more importantly, I'd like you to write in the comments where you are listening from. I always imagine these words traveling far, and I would love to know the places they reach. She gave up her home, her land, her future, so her child could have his. And in the end, all she had left was an empty room and a name that no one called anymore. Please watch until the end, because some stories can only be understood when you see how they finish. It was late evening. I was sitting by the window, the glass cold against my temple. In my hands was a letter, its paper thin and yellowed with age, the handwriting slightly faded but still clear, his handwriting. The date at the top said March 14th, 1991. The last letter I ever received from him. 30 years had passed, but the words still cut deep, as if he'd written them yesterday. I closed my eyes, and for a moment, I was no longer an old woman with silver hair and aching joints. I was 29 again, standing in the small front yard of a wooden house in a village so tiny you could walk from one end to the other in 15 minutes. It was the spring of 1976. The air smelled of damp earth and wood smoke from stoves. My son Daniel was 12, tall for his age, with dark hair always falling into his eyes, and a smile that could light up even the coldest winter morning. Back then, we had little, just a patch of land with a vegetable garden, a few chickens, and that house my late husband built before he died. Money was scarce, but Daniel never complained. He would come home from school, throw his satchel on the table, and run to help me with the garden or feed the hens. Sometimes we'd sit on the porch in the evening, watching the sun go down over the hills, and he would talk about the future. Not about tractors or crops, like the other boys, but about cities with tall buildings, about books and things he'd read in the library. One day, his teacher came to visit. She was a serious woman with glasses that made her eyes look twice their size. She told me, in a voice both urgent and cautious, that Daniel was one of the brightest students she had ever taught. He should, she said, continue his education in the city. She spoke of opportunities, scholarships, and the kind of life I could never give him here. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed listening to the wind scrape against the shutters, thinking about what she'd said. The city was far. We had no relatives there, and even if he got into a good school, how would we pay for his lodging, his books, his food? But as I thought of Daniel's eager face, his restless hunger for knowledge, something in me broke, not in despair, but in decision. I didn't know it then, but that night would be the first step toward the choice that would change my life forever. The choice to give him everything, even if it meant losing everything I had. The year was 1970. Back then, our little village didn't have much. No paved roads, no street lights, no shops beyond a single general store that sold everything from nails to bread. Life was simple, and if you were lucky, it was steady. I wasn't lucky. My husband had died in a mill accident when Daniel was just 4, The day they carried him home, the sun was bright, but everything in me went dark. Raising a child alone in a place like ours wasn't easy. I took work wherever I could find it, mending clothes for neighbors, washing laundry for the family that owned the store, sometimes cleaning the school when the janitor was ill. My hands were always cracked from soap and cold water, but I never let Daniel see me cry. Our house was small, just 2 rooms and a kitchen with a wood-burning stove. In the mornings, I'd light it before dawn, and Daniel would come shuffling out in his worn pajamas, rubbing his eyes. He'd sit at the table with a piece of bread and butter while I braided his hair. Yes, he wore it long then, like his father. And I'd tell him to be good in school. He was different from the other children. While they played with sticks and stones, he read. Not just school books, anything he could get his hands on. Old newspapers, borrowed novels, even the instruction manuals from the neighbor's sewing machine. Sometimes I would find him lying on his stomach in the garden, reading aloud to the chickens as if they could understand him. But being different in a small place is dangerous. Other boys teased him, called him Professor, sometimes pushed him around. He never fought back. Instead, he'd look them in the eye and say, "One day I'll be somewhere else." And then he'd walk away, head high. I remember one winter evening when he came home shivering, his coat thin and torn. He had a library book under his arm. He'd walked 5 kilometers to the next town just to borrow it. I asked him why he'd go so far in the cold, and he just smiled and said, "Because I wanted to know how the story ends." That was Daniel, stubborn, curious, unafraid of effort. And it was that stubbornness that made me believe his teacher was right. He didn't belong to the narrow lanes and the low skies of our village. He belonged to a bigger world. But a bigger world came with a bigger price, and I had no idea how I would pay it. The teacher's words stayed with me for days, echoing in my head while I worked. He has a gift. Don't let it go to waste. I wanted to believe there was a way, but every time I counted the coins in my jar, the truth stared back at me. It wasn't enough, not even close. At night, I'd sit at the kitchen table after Daniel had gone to bed, running my fingers over the rough wood, thinking. The stove would burn low, the room lit only by a small oil lamp. Sometimes I'd hear Daniel talking in his sleep, murmuring strange words he'd read in books, names of cities, foreign places I couldn't even imagine. He was already halfway out of our little world, and I knew that if I didn't help him cross the rest of the way, he might never forgive me. But there was the other fear. The city was far, and I'd heard stories, boys who went and never came back, swallowed up by the noise, the crowds, the temptations. What if I lost him? Not to death, but to distance. Still, what kind of mother keeps her child small just to keep him close? One afternoon, I was mending a neighbor's coat when Daniel came in, breathless. His cheeks were flushed from running, and in his hands he held a pamphlet, an admissions flyer from a school in the capital. Someone at the library had given it to him. The paper was creased and smudged, but his eyes shone brighter than I'd ever seen them. "They teach everything, Mama," he said. "Science, languages, history. There's even a laboratory." He spoke so quickly I could barely keep up, his voice tumbling over itself with excitement. I smiled, but inside my stomach knotted. I knew what this meant. There was no stopping him now. He'd set his heart on it. That night, I lay awake, listening to the wind rattle the shutters. My mind kept drifting to the same place, the attic, Up there, beneath an old quilt, was the last of my mother's jewellery, the wedding rings, the silver candlesticks my husband had once bought in the city, and, of course, the deed to our land. By dawn, my decision was made. I would sell it all. The house, the field, the chickens, even the ring on my finger if I had to. I would rent a single room for myself and send every coin to Daniel's future. I told myself it was the right thing, that I was giving him wings. But even as I imagined him in the city, walking down wide streets with books under his arm, a shadow settled over me. Because deep down I knew, once he flew away, there might be no reason for him to return. The first thing I sold was the land. It was the heart of our life, the vegetable garden, the apple trees my husband had planted, the strip of earth where Daniel had learned to walk. A man from the next village came with a folded envelope of cash, and I signed the papers with a hand that wouldn't stop shaking. I told myself it was just dirt and grass, that the memories would stay even if the soil didn't. But when he walked away, the empty space where our garden had been felt like a hole inside me. Next was the house. I'd lived there since my wedding day, every corner worn smooth by years of footsteps, laughter, and sorrow. I scrubbed the floors until my knees ached, as if cleaning it would make it easier to let go. A young couple bought it, smiling politely, already talking about the changes they would make, painting the walls, replacing the old stove. I nodded and wished them well, but the moment they left, I went to the bedroom and pressed my face into the pillow one last time, breathing in the smell of home. The hardest part came last, my mother's jewellery and my wedding ring. I took them to a man in the city who dealt in gold. He weighed each piece, tapping numbers into a small calculator, his eyes never meeting mine. When he told me the total, I felt both relief and grief. It was enough to pay for Daniel's first year in the capital, his lodging, his books, his clothes, enough to give him the start he deserved. I returned to the village with an empty satchel and a pocket full of banknotes. Daniel was waiting at the door, eyes wide, as I handed him the envelope. He looked at me like I had given him the world. "I'll make you proud, Mama," he said. The day he left, the whole village seemed to gather at the bus stop. Daniel stood tall in his new coat, a second-hand suitcase at his side. I tried to memorize everything, the way his hair fell across his forehead, the small scar on his cheek from when he fell off a fence as a boy. When the bus arrived, he hugged me quickly, too quickly, and climbed aboard. I stood there until the dust settled and the road was empty. That night, I moved into the rented room I'd found above a bakery in the nearby town. It was small, with a single bed and a window that looked out onto the alley, but I told myself it didn't matter. My home now was wherever Daniel's future would take him. I didn't know it yet, but the sound of that bus driving away would echo in my memory for the rest of my life. The first weeks after Daniel left, I filled my days with work to keep the loneliness from swallowing me whole. I cleaned rooms at a small hotel by the river, swept the bakery floors in exchange for day-old bread, and mended clothes late into the night by the dim glow of a single lamp. I wrote to him every Sunday without fail. My letters were long and careful, telling him about the weather, the gossip from our old neighbours, and reminding him to eat properly. I would end each one with the same words, "I am proud of you, my son." At first, his replies came quickly. He described the city in glowing detail, the tram lines, the tall buildings, the libraries that seemed to go on forever. He wrote about professors who treated him like an equal, about friends from faraway places who spoke languages I couldn't pronounce. His words painted a picture so vivid I could almost walk those streets myself. He would always promise that once his studies were done, he would return. "You'll never have to work again, Mamma," he wrote. "You'll have a garden again, bigger than before, I promise." I carried those promises with me like precious stones. On the hardest days, when my back ached and my hands were raw from scrubbing floors, I'd unfold one of his letters and read it slowly, letting each word remind me why I had given up everything. But time moves differently when you're apart. The seasons turned, and with each passing month, the distance between us seemed to stretch. His letters became shorter, less frequent. Sometimes they arrived without a return address. I told myself he was just busy, that city life was demanding, that exams and work left him little time. Still, I waited by the mailbox every week, and every week that went by without a letter felt like a small crack in the wall I'd built around my heart. If you've ever sacrificed something precious for someone you love, I'd like to hear your story. Write it in the comments. I read everyone. Sometimes sharing the weight is the only way it feels lighter. The first sign came so quietly, I almost missed it. One of his letters arrived in late spring, written on a scrap of notebook paper instead of the crisp stationery he used to favor. His handwriting looked rushed, uneven. He told me he'd found a part-time job in a cafe to make some extra money, and that he was spending a lot of time with new friends who opened his eyes to the world. It was a strange phrase, opened my eyes to the world. Daniel had always been the one eager to see the world. Why did it sound as if he needed someone else to show him now? In the weeks that followed, the letters slowed even more. Sometimes months passed without a word, and when they came, they were lighter, emptier. No talk of lectures or exams, more about nights out, concerts, people I'd never heard of. He still called me Mama, but the word felt like a formality now, a title without the warmth it once carried. One day I decided to call him at the boarding house where he was staying. The landlady answered, her voice polite but cautious. "Oh, Daniel. He's hardly here these days. Always out, always busy. Would you like me to leave a message?" I told her yes, but he never called back. I began to notice other changes too. The money I sent for books sometimes went unacknowledged. Once, when I mentioned it in a letter, he replied weeks later with a short note. "I'm fine. Stop worrying so much." It was the first time he'd ever told me not to worry. At night, I'd lie awake, staring at the cracked ceiling of my rented room, telling myself he was just finding his way, that all young men drift a little when they taste freedom. But in my gut, I felt the pull of something colder, the quiet knowledge that the boy I had raised might be slipping away from me. And yet, I clung to hope. Because when you've given everything, hope is all you have left to give. The last letter came in early December. It was short, barely half a page, but it carried the same easy charm he'd always had. He wrote that he was busy with new opportunities, that he might not make it home for the holidays, but we'd see each other soon enough. I held on to that phrase, soon enough. I told myself it meant the next month, maybe 2. I even started knitting him a scarf, imagining how he'd laugh at my crooked stitches when he finally came through the door. Christmas came and went. The scarf stayed folded at the foot of my bed. In January, I sent another letter, and another the month after that. No answer. By March, I had written 5 times with no reply. I scraped together the money for a train ticket and went to the city. I found the boarding house, but the landlady looked at me with pity. "Oh, love, he moved out months ago, left no address." She said it gently, as if she were afraid I might break right there in her doorway. I spent the rest of the day wandering the streets, asking in shops and cafes, but no one knew him. The city that had once felt so full of promise now felt like a vast cold ocean, and I was drowning in it. When I returned to my small rented room, I placed the unfinished scarf in the drawer and stopped writing letters. I still waited for the postman, but now it was out of habit, not expectation. Days turned into weeks, weeks into years. People in town stopped asking about him after a while. Some assumed he had made a life too busy for visits. Others whispered that maybe he'd left for good. I told them nothing. I kept my silence like a shield, because speaking the truth, that I didn't know where my only son was, felt like inviting the whole world to witness my failure. And so the years began to pass, each one quieter than the last. Time has a strange way of making pain feel both sharper and duller at once. The days blurred into each other, but the absence never softened. I'd wake up in my narrow bed, and for a split second forget, half expecting to hear his footsteps in the hallway. Then the silence would settle, heavy as a blanket. I kept his old schoolbook stacked neatly in a box under the bed. His handwriting was still on the margins. Small notes, underlined words, little sketches of birds or shapes he must have drawn when he was bored. Sometimes, on rainy afternoons, I'd take them out just to run my fingers over the pages, as if touching the paper could somehow bridge the years between us. The scarf I'd started knitting stayed in the drawer. The yarn had gone stiff, the needles still tucked into a row of uneven stitches. I couldn't bring myself to finish it. It felt like a promise I wasn't ready to close. Neighbours came and went. Some moved to bigger towns, chasing work. Others died. The children I once knew grew into adults, then had children of their own. I became the quiet widow in the room above the bakery, someone people nodded to politely but rarely spoke with. Every spring, I would plant flowers in a small wooden box outside my window. Bright geraniums, marigolds, sometimes lavender if I could afford it. I imagined Daniel walking down the street one day, seeing them, and somehow knowing it was my window. I never remarried. People assumed it was because I loved my late husband too much, but the truth was simpler. My heart was already entirely given, and it had nowhere else to go. Years turned into decades. My hair turned silver, my hands gnarled and lined. But even in the winter of my life, a part of me kept looking at the door when footsteps passed in the hall, hoping they might stop outside my room. Hope, I've learned, doesn't always fade. Sometimes it just becomes a quieter kind of waiting. It was a grey afternoon in late autumn when the truth finally came to me. Not from Daniel, but from a voice I barely recognized. I was sitting by the bakery window, sipping tea, when a woman walked in. She was dressed in a heavy coat, her scarf pulled up to her chin. She hesitated when she saw me, then smiled faintly. "You're Daniel's mother, aren't you?" My heart leapt so quickly I almost spilled my cup. "Do you know him? Have you seen him?" The words tumbled out before I could stop them. She nodded. "I saw him, years ago, abroad." "Abroad?" My voice cracked on the word. Yes, she said gently. I was visiting my sister in Canada. We went to a community event and there he was, with a woman and 2 children. He looked happy. The world seemed to tilt. I gripped the edge of the table. Did you speak to him? She shook her head. I thought about it, but he seemed so different. He didn't notice me. I asked someone later, and they said he'd been living there for a long time. Has a good job, a nice house. My throat tightened. And he never wrote to me. Her eyes softened with pity. Maybe he thought it would be too hard to explain. Or maybe he didn't want to come back. The bakery's warm air suddenly felt stifling. I mumbled something about needing to get home and left, my feet moving on their own. I climbed the narrow stairs to my room and sat on the bed, staring at the wall. So that was it. He wasn't lost, or dead, or struggling. He had simply chosen another life, one without me in it. The realization hurt in a way I can't put into words. I had sold my home, my land, my future, so he could have his. And in doing so, I had given him the means to leave me behind forever. That night, for the first time in many years, I wept until the candle burned out. I didn't sleep that night. The shadows on the ceiling shifted with the candlelight until they faded into morning. By the time the first rays of sun touched my window, my tears had dried, leaving only a dull ache behind my eyes. I made tea and sat by the window, watching the street come alive. People passed by with baskets and bags. Children ran ahead of their mothers. The baker swept his front step. Life went on, as it always had, as it always would, with or without my son. I realized then that I couldn't keep waiting. Waiting had been my life for too long, and it had cost me more years than I could count. Daniel had chosen his life, and I had to choose mine, even if mine was smaller, quieter, and lonelier than I once dreamed. I took the unfinished scarf from the drawer. My fingers traced the uneven stitches before I began to pull the yarn free. It felt strange, undoing something that had been frozen in time for so many years, but as the loops unraveled, I felt something in my chest loosen too. That afternoon, I went to the market and bought new yarn, not for him, but for a blanket I'd make for myself. Something warm to wrap around my own shoulders in the winter, a comfort that belonged only to me. I am not angry at him anymore. Anger is heavy, and I am too old to carry it. I am not even sad in the way I once was. What remains is a quiet acceptance, and a hope that wherever he is safe, and maybe, sometimes, he remembers the little house with the vegetable garden and the mother who loved him enough to let him go. If you've listened this far, I want to thank you, and I want to ask, would you have done the same in my place? Write your answer in the comments. I read them all, and sometimes your words are the closest thing to company I have. Because no matter how far the years take us, a story is never truly over until someone listens.